Chapter 17 of A Copper Harvest by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17 A Copper Harvest. 10 days after the death of Gideon Prahl, Jack Howard stood in the freight yard of the Montana Central Railroad and watched car 999 with its waybill, which contained specifications for the contents and destination of the car, attached in plain sight, being pushed into place at the tail end of an eastbound freight train then being made up to leave the yard at 7 that evening. Jack was interested in that particular car because it contained his smelted copper, now ready for market. He intended to take a passenger train himself at 8 for New York. While he was standing a little distance away between the tracks, another long train, made up of empties, backed down and shut out from his view the particular train to which car 999 was attached. It was some minutes before the empties passed down the line, but when they did, Jack saw the man who had been pointed out to him as the conductor of the 7 o'clock eastbound freight, in company with 2 other men, one of whom carried one of his arms in a sling, standing in front of car 999 talking earnestly. This circumstance would not have impressed the boy in the least but for the fact that the men made occasional gestures toward the car which contained the copper, and this circumstance struck him as suspicious. Coupled with it was the knowledge that Otis Clymer and his confederate Coffee were at large, and that it was by no means improbable that they still entertained designs against the interests of the owners of the Pandora mines. Jack pulled his soft hat well down over his eyes, walked over to a switch and leaned against it in such a way as to keep his eyes upon the conductor and the 2 men with whom he was talking. He noticed that both the fellow with his arm in a sling and his companion kept glancing around frequently in a way which struck him as suspicious. "I never saw Coffee, the scoundrel who shot Mr. Prahl, and therefore cannot say if this fellow bears any resemblance to him," mused Jack. "But I do know he was hit in the arm by the prospector on that fatal occasion. As for the other, that may be Otis Clymer disguised. He's about the same height and build as the ex-drug clerk. I must say I don't like the look of things. There may be nothing in it, but all the same they seem to be taking an uncommon interest in that car of mine. And that reminds me of the story Mr. Prahl told us one evening of the stealing of a car of copper matte in which a friend of his was interested. The rascals painted out the number of the car and shunted it off in a branch line where another car was due. Then, when the car was found again, it was empty, and of course nobody knew what had become of the stuff that was in it. It had just disappeared mysteriously. Such a thing could only be accomplished by bribing the conductor of the freight. I would not like to have such a game played off on me." At this point in the boy's reflections, the conductor received a small package from one of the men, which he immediately dropped into his pocket, and then the 3 walked slowly down the track. Jack immediately dashed around to the other side of the line of loaded freight cars, and ran down the track till he caught up with the trio who were walking on the other side of the train. He kept pace with them until he reached the front car, and then stood in its shadow in order to get a closer observation of the 3 men, in 2 of whom he now felt a great interest. Fate willed that they too should come to a halt on the other side of the car, and easily within earshot of the bright boy. "You won't fail us then, Dorgan," said the man in the heavy beard, whose tones had such a familiar ring to Jack that he instinctively muttered, "That is Otis Clymer sure enough. Therefore there's no doubt whatever in my mind that the wounded man is Coffee. Evidently there is some mischief on foot." And this fact was made certain to the boy when the conductor replied, "You can rely on me. I'll have a car of copper shunted off at Benson's Crossing. You had better have your teams on hand as soon after midnight as possible, for we're due there at 11:55 p.m. I'll see to it that the number of the car is altered to 900, which is the number of an empty I've got to leave at the crossing." "All right," said Coffee. "We're going down on the 8 o'clock passenger, which stops at Phalanx, a mile this side of Benson's." The 2 schemers then crossed over to the end of the freight sheds and disappeared. "So those scoundrels have arranged to steal my car of ore," said Jack to himself as he walked slowly back the way he had come. "And I'll bet it's not entirely for the value of the stuff they're doing this, either. They've a deeper game. They think now that the mine is in possession of mere boys that the loss of this carload of pure copper may ruin and discourage us, and that through their agents they stand a good chance of buying in the mining property cheap. I fancy they'll find they're up against a different kind of proposition. It's up to me to prepare a surprise for those chaps at Benson's Crossing, and I guess I haven't any time to lose if I'm going to do it." Jack Howard hoofed it in short order to the office of the division superintendent and had an interview with that official. The gentleman was incredulous at first. "What? Steal a freight car?" he exclaimed amazedly. "Impossible! Nobody could work a scheme like that on our line and get away with it." But Jack succeeded in convincing him that there really was a piece of villainy on foot, and the superintendent, after considering the matter, agreed to fall in with the plan proposed by the boy to defeat it. At a few minutes after 10 that night, the eastbound passengers stopped as per schedule at Phalanx. The only passengers to alight on the platform were the disguised climber and his companion in iniquity, Coffee. On the other side, however, Jack Howard, the division superintendent, and 3 officers of the Marysville police force stepped off into the darkness and started at once through the gloom for Benson's, where they duly arrived and concealed themselves close to the siding. At 11:55, the whistle of the eastbound freight was heard a short distance down the line. 2 minutes later, the freight slowed up and stopped at the crossing, and then the car next to the caboose, which bore the number 900, was shunted onto the siding. Then the train went on. 10 minutes later, several teams appeared, and one of them was backed up against the freight car. The waybill had previously been torn from the car, and the door left unsecured. Several men provided with shovels came up, and under the direction of the 2 villains, whom Jack pointed out to the officers, started in to unload the car. That, however, was as far as they got. Half an hour later, the night express was signaled at Phalanx, and when it came to a stop, it was boarded by the superintendent, Jack Howard, and the 2 Maryville officers in charge of the handcuffed Otis Clymer and the saloon keeper, Coffee. Coffee was afterward taken back to Trinity to stand trial for the murder of Gideon Prawl, and eventually was convicted and executed for the crime. As for Clymer, he was taken back to Sackville on a requisition from the governor of Nebraska, and was tried on a double indictment of attempted murder and arson, and received a sentence of 20 years in the state prison. Jack Howard went on to New York, disposed of the carload of copper which arrived safely, interested a few capitalists in his copper mine, formed the Pandora Company in accordance with the laws of the state of New York, had himself elected president and manager, with Meyer Dinkelspiel for his assistant, while Charlie Fox was elected secretary, and then returned to the scene of operations in Montana. That the Pandora copper mine proved a winner, and that Jack Howard eventually became a millionaire, with Charlie Fox and Meyer Dinkelspiel rated at least half as much each, is a proven fact, for put into operation under modern methods, the mine turned out ore so fast and so rich that the newspapers of the day always alluded to it as a copper harvest. The end. End of Chapter 17. End of A Copper Harvest by a Self-Made Man. End of Fame and Fortune Weekly, number 10. Recording by Keith Salis.